Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Samuel Culper.
Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to Out Front with Samuel Culper. I am your host, Samuel Culper, and we're coming to you live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. In addition to live streaming at forwardobserver.fm, we're also on all major podcast platforms now. We're also on YouTube. We are in as many places as we can be right now. On today's show, I am encouraging listeners with some very specific advice, encouraging you to examine your assumptions about the future. And then I want to wrap up the show with whatever time is left with some very important thoughts on Alexander the Great. I've read a couple of his biographies now. History repeats itself, and I will tell you exactly how the history of Alexander the Great rhymes with what we're living through right now. It's undeniable, in my opinion. But first, the show is brought to you by Intel Bootcamp, an accelerated online learning platform for tactical intelligence skills. During emergencies, we're going to have blind spots that only intelligence gathering can solve. Intel Bootcamp contains 30 lessons on intelligence gathering, analysis, battle tracking, gear selection, organizing your Intel team, and a whole lot more. You can sign up at www.intelbootcamp.com. Well, we all have a picture of what we think we're going to experience in the future. I've repeatedly gone into great detail about my expectations of what I believe about the future, specifically the near-term future, that a potential Trump victory in November or December or whenever it's announced is going to blow this country's urban insurgencies wide open. But what if my expectations are wrong? What if your expectations are wrong? What if what we are preparing for is not what ends up happening? Well, one of the most important things we can do in intelligence analysis is ask ourselves why. Why do we believe what we do? What makes us arrive at this conclusion? Do we have enough evidence to arrive at this conclusion? Is this an unfounded conclusion? Have we made an analytic leap? Have we tried to cross the chasm by jumping it instead of putting something under our feet that will lead us to the other side? Have we considered any alternatives? Is there any evidence that's missing that might lead us to believe something different if we only knew it? Well, here's a good case in history. I was actually just combing through this book, two cases. I was combing through this book called Why Nations Go to War or The Causes of War or something like that. And in this book, the author right now is talking about the events that led up to World War I. And of course, the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. Everyone knows that. But what I was very interested to learn is that the German Chancellor did not think the Austro-Hungarian Empire would go to war with Serbia and ultimately with Russia, because Russia stepped in and they said, hey, if you go to war with Serbia, we're going to get involved. And the German Chancellor did not think that there was going to be a war. He kind of brushed it aside. As a matter of fact, he went on vacation. Like a couple days after the assassination of Ferdinand, he spoke with the leader of Austria, and he said, well, whatever happens, just know that Germany is going to support you. And he said that with every intention of not going to war because he did not think a war was going to happen. And then he went on vacation. Well, we all know what happened after that. Several years ago, I spent some time in Santiago, Chile. I was learning Spanish there. And by the way, Chile is a horrible place to learn Spanish. But I had a lot of fun when I was there. Chilean Spanish is kind of like redneck Spanish, I think. They tend to cut off a lot of syllables, especially at the end of words. I was amazed at how great Chile was compared to its South American neighbors. because there was very little corruption in their police forces. Santiago is a very European city. It's a very clean city. There are some very safe neighborhoods. I was in Providencia for about 3 months. And it was really an incredible experience. For a few bucks, actually we did this several times a week. For a few bucks, you could buy a pint of Stella and basically a bratwurst sausage. They called it I don't know, it was called a shop. You just go there and you order a shop, like SCHOP. There's so many Germans that went to Argentina and Chile, and Italians and Spaniards, obviously. There's a lot of white people in Santiago, ethnically, whatever they are. Racially, they're white. Same with Argentina. Actually, a guy just the other day posted this picture of the distribution of whites all across the world, and Argentina was not white, according to this map. And Argentina is a very white country. I don't know if that guy had ever been there or not. As a matter of fact, Buenos Aires is something like 90% white, roughly. In short, to wrap this up, Chile is an amazing country. And I remember going to, they have a museum there that's dedicated to the victims of fascism, or something to that effect, to the victims of the coup there in 1973. And I remember asking the guy, I said, what about the victims of communism what about the victims of communism and socialism under Allende? Because some of them, they killed a bunch of people. He didn't really like that question. Or maybe he didn't understand it because I spoke it in broken Spanish. But anyway, I've often wondered how the coup of 1973 and its effects were able to create this pretty incredible diamond in the rough. Because that's basically what Chile is, especially Santiago. It really is. It's a diamond in the rough. Santiago's not perfect. When I was down there, the citizens elected a socialist president. Twice they elected her, once in 2006 and then again in 2014 when I was there. Michelle Bachelet. And for some background here, this coup in 1973 was backed by CIA. And they toppled the socialist president of Chile, a guy named Salvador Allende, in 1973. And the Chilean general, Augusto Pinochet, took over about a year later. Well, a couple years ago, I was reading, actually this was last year, I was reading through a socialist magazine called Jacobin. And I'm a subscriber. I read a lot of their articles. And in one of the articles they had in there last year, there was a translation of a 1971 interview of Allende by the Italian communist news outlet called Il Manifesto. And here's what I found interesting. Here's what Allende had to say. He said, this is 2 years before the coup. Allende said, quote, "If anyone believes that in Chile an army coup d'etat would play out like in other Latin American countries with a simple changing of the guard here at La Moneda," which is the presidential palace there in Santiago, he continues, "they're badly mistaken. Here, if the army breaks out of legality, it means civil war. Do you believe the socialist workers would let industry be taken off them, or the peasants the land? There will be 100,000 dead, a bloodbath." That's what Allende had to say if there was a coup attempt. Well, the coup went down very successfully, and that bloodbath obviously never materialized. Not in terms of a civil war like Allende was talking about, although there was a bloodbath. I think it's interesting how in 1971, Allende, just 2 years before he was toppled in this coup, it's interesting how Allende's expectations failed to meet reality. Why did he believe that the army would essentially split in two, or there would be this massive peasant revolt, and they would all take up arms, and they would defeat the Chilean army if there was a coup? Why did he believe this? Why were his expectations so divorced from what actually occurred? And my mind naturally went to, why do so many people in America expect a similar bloodbath of hundreds of thousands of people dead during this conflict? Right? One reason why I really dislike, and by the way, I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but there's this expectation of a civil war where you're going to have two sides fighting each other. And I've repeatedly expressed my doubt that that's what ends up happening. I think this is a multi-sided conflict, and I don't think we're going to be like fighting pitched battles where hundreds or thousands of people die during this battle, like during the Civil War, tens of thousands of people. There is no doubt in my mind that this conflict in the United States, however, has already started. I think it probably started back in 2016. But I've talked about low intensity conflict before. That's my expectation. But some massive conflict where hundreds of thousands of Americans die by combat in the street, fighting each other, that is not my baseline expectation. I just don't think that's going to happen. There's this really great book by Sebastian Junger called Tribe. And he writes about how British officials back during World War II, they feared anarchy and sheer pandemonium during these German air raids. And they hired all these British psychologists, and they came to this conclusion that there was going to be anarchy and mass chaos. And these psychologists were getting ready for mass cases of psychological trauma. And the British leaders at the time, according to Junger, the British leaders feared this mental health crisis that was going to last for decades as a result of these air raids. And they just thought they were going to have a really an endemic and persistent mental health care problem. But those expectations failed to meet reality because that's not what happened. Instead, Junger writes that a societal collapse during these bombing campaigns is not what happened, but that Brits worked together cooperatively. They came together as a community, and they had this reinforced sense of community and belonging, and they took care of each other during these air raids. And there was no anarchy. There was no pandemonium because the Brits came together and they understood that there was a greater purpose and that these air raids would eventually pass, and they had to continue supporting the war effort. The Brits worked together and they made do. And Junger describes in this book called Tribe, which is a fantastic book. It's not that long either. He says that after the war, a lot of these Brits recalled that they actually missed that sense of community. They had a tribe. These air sirens, these air raid sirens were going off in the background. They could hear explosions. They could feel the shock of these explosions in the city. And they had developed a sense of tribe during England's darkest days of World War II. And I'm not trying to make any argument here. I'm not saying that there will be no anarchy or no pandemonium in America during this conflict once it actually heats up. Because the circumstances affecting 1940 England and 2020 America are vastly different. But it's important to me, it's just another example of a reason. It's another example to me that we always have to question our assumptions. Because Allende had this faulty assumption that he basically couldn't be thrown from power. Basically that there would be this massive civil uprising that would keep him in power. And that didn't happen. He was dead wrong. In fact, he literally was dead wrong because he committed suicide during the coup. Allegedly. And these British leaders, they expected societal collapse due to carpet bombing. And it didn't happen. British society, English society did not collapse in the 1940s. They waited until the 2010s to do that, to have a societal collapse like their society is collapsing now. We never want to go to war with faulty assumptions. We never want to base our plans or arrive at some expectations of the future based on faulty assumptions. And I'm not preoccupied with it, but I do think often. I do think a question often. What if? What if our expectations that November is just going to be a circus? Actually, a circus is an understatement. What if our expectations that November is going to be some potentially catastrophic period of time, days or weeks, where resulting in just this calamitous nationwide failure of civility. I know why I think that. I just sometimes happen to question why I might be wrong. Look at some alternatives. By the way, pretty interesting. If you ever go to La Moneda there in Santiago, they've obviously done a bunch of restoration work to that presidential palace, but you can see on the outside, on the facade, there's still these pockmarks on the side of the building where bullets impacted, and they're still there for you to see. It's pretty interesting if you ever get a chance to go to Santiago, which I highly recommend eventually one day. I don't know, maybe one day people will get a chance to go there again. Super cool, great city. Well, moving on, let's talk about Alexander next, because I finished last year. I read a book called Alexander the Great by Freeman, which was a biography, and that was the second one I read on him, and it really cemented my opinion that Alexander the Great was not just a brilliant military commander. I think he's probably one of the most successful humans to ever have lived. And he had lots of faults. I read that book, and I remember 3 or 4 times throughout the book just saying, why is this guy so stupid? Or I can't believe. It's like you have this. I have this statue of Alexander the Great. It's on top of my bookshelf. And I look at it sometimes, and I'm like, man, I'm way behind on life. But he was human. He had a lot of errors, and I want to talk about one of those errors today because although he did some incredible things as a leader, he also made some catastrophic mistakes. And I think that the United States of America is living through one of those catastrophic mistakes that he made. And I want to focus the rest of this show on the portion towards the end of this book, Alexander the Great, published in 2017. When Alexander's military begins to disintegrate. So in the very beginning, Alexander led this. He was the leader of an ethno-state of Macedonia, and he led this Macedonian army, which was 100% Macedonian. And they started to conquer these Greek city-states, and then you would have these Greek forces who surrendered end up joining the Macedonian army. Well, they were all Greek. They spoke very similar languages. They all knew Greek. And they basically spoke the same language. They had pretty similar cultures. And they all considered themselves Greek, even though there may have been some slight differences in culture and language. But as Alexander and his army began marching through Mesopotamia, as they conquered these Mesopotamian outposts, they conquered Babylon, Persia, Bactria, Sogdiana, basically into Central Asia. And then they get to the Indus River Valley. Every single time they conquered an army, these surrendered troops of what were previously enemies often ended up joining this imperial army. And there's a key distinction that needs to be made here, because Alexander's Macedonian army became diverse, not only ethnically, but they also spoke different languages. And they didn't have the same military cultures, and they didn't have the same military tactics. And that was how Alexander, basically what ended up happening is Alexander started to Macedonianize some of these other troops. And he taught them all these Macedonian tactics. And, ethnically, racially, obviously, they would never become Macedonian. But they could become culturally Macedonian. When Alexander went and conquered Persia, he started adopting Persian behaviors and clothing because he thought, the king of Persia is much better than being the king of Macedonia. And so he became Persian because Persia was much larger than the kingdom of Macedonia. And he drew a lot of scorn from his military commanders. As a matter of fact, there may have been at least one instance where one of his members of the military tried to murder Alexander because he became Persian. It's like he threw off this mantle, or he threw off this identity of being Macedonian, like the original core of his army. And he became Persian. He became something else. And some of his military leaders didn't like that. In the eyes of his men, he had discarded his Macedonian identity. And as he led this increasingly diverse, imperial, multi-ethnic, and multicultural army, some of his troops began having problems. To be fair, Alexander was in a tough spot. One reason why he adopted these Persian customs is because he wanted the Persians to recognize him as the new Persian king of kings. He beat Darius III, who was the grandson of Darius Kabir, which literally translates to Darius the Great. And he had this problem because there's this massive Persian empire, and he wanted them to recognize him as the Persian king. That's part of why he became Persian. And that caused a lot of resentment among Macedonians because their king, who they literally fought and bled for, some of whom died for, quit being one of them, and he became someone else. Later on, Alexander took a Bactrian wife, and as they went through and conquered these foreign lands and foreign people, he gave his generals foreign wives as well. Because what he wanted to do was solidify his empire through intermarriage. He thought, well, if my generals are marrying into the local populace, so they're marrying the daughters of these tribal elders, then we'll solidify the empire now. Because we'll have familial relations. We will be linked by family with all of these people who are not Macedonian. The problem was that a lot of his Macedonian generals, who were older than him, by the way, Alexander was in his 20s when all this was happening. His Macedonian generals, they already had wives and children back in Macedonia. And they started to resent Alexander's attempts to diversify his empire. They said, why should I take a Persian wife? Why should I take a Bactrian wife? I have a Macedonian wife at home whom I love. I have children with this woman. Why am I being forced to marry someone I don't want to marry? Because these were people with unknown languages and these weird foreign cultures. Alexander had this 10-year campaign. He's in his 30s at the end of this. And his army basically quits on him. They get to the Indus River Valley, and they just had enough. They said, we've been fighting this war for 10 years. We want to go home to our wives. We want to go home to our children. And they said, we're not going to go any further. As Alexander was listening to these grumblings among his men, he started training up these foreign forces, these foreign elements of his army in Macedonian tactics. And he began replacing his Macedonian generals and fighters. He started sending them back home and replacing them with these foreign generals because he didn't need the Macedonians anymore. And he started replacing large parts of his army with foreign fighters, despite the fact that his Macedonians had been with him since the very beginning. And now these Macedonians had foreign commanders who did not know Macedonian tactics as well as they did. And Alexander ignored these sentiments. And he continued to order more and more of these Macedonians back home after replacing them with foreign generals and foreign fighters. And I only mention this because this is exactly what the elites are doing to Americans. This is exactly what's happening in America. We have this old America, predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and others of European descent, who, by the way, made up roughly 90% of America as late as 1965. And they're being replaced with new Americans, immigrants from foreign places who aren't traditionally American. Back during these debates that have been happening earlier this year, especially among the Democrats, they've really made it known they have decreasing use. They have less and less use for America's white majority. They're calling it evil now. It's white supremacy. And they're focused on bringing as many immigrants into the United States as possible. And they say it's because immigration fuels economic growth. Even Republicans, even some conservatives say mass immigration fuels economic growth. The more immigrants we can stuff into this place, the better economy we're going to have. And they bow down at the altar of the economy despite the side effects that are happening to the country. And just like Alexander's Macedonians, old America is feeling discarded as more and more new immigrants and their voting patterns terraform the U.S. electorate. Now, I could be entirely wrong. I don't think I am. But I suspect that this country's current cultural, social, and political disintegration is not dissimilar to the disintegration of the Macedonian Empire. Because what happened, the only thing keeping this multi-ethnic, multicultural empire together was Alexander. Alexander didn't even make it back home to Pella. That's where he's from. He died in Babylon. He died on his way back home. By the way, how his army gets back home is an absolutely incredible story. I don't have time for it right now. But after Alexander died, the Macedonian Empire fell very quickly to infighting among all these basically warring tribes now. You have the strong man who keeps everything together. He dies, and basically it's a free-for-all. And they start carving up the Macedonian Empire according to, it's basically might makes right at that point. And Alexander's mother, she's fighting. She says, well, Alexander's dead. I'm the queen. Nobody listens to her. These Macedonian generals are fighting and killing for power. You have these foreign forces, these foreign generals fighting for power. And not too much later, there's an upstart Roman army that would march across Macedonia, modern-day Macedonia. And that was the very end for the once great and very short-lived Macedonian Empire. Alexander died at the age of 23, this 10-year campaign, from age 23 to age 33. He dies at 33. And he never named a successor. According to historians cited in this book and others, he's on his deathbed. Alexander's dying. He's on his deathbed. They don't know what's wrong with him. They try all these potions and drinks and all this stuff, and none of it's working. And his advisors, they ask him, they say, to whom should this kingdom be left? Who should be your replacement? And he looks at them and he says, to the strongest. Alexander tells them the strongest person possible is going to be the one to replace him. We eventually go back to might makes right. And whenever there's a power vacuum, we can pretend in democracy and have these votes and whatever. But dying empires become a power vacuum. And you know who inherits those empires? The strongest dude on the block. Alexander lied to his men throughout this 10-year campaign. He basically said, hey, let's go to this next place, let's conquer them, and then we'll be done. And then they get there, and his men fight for him, they conquer this next place, and then he says, hey, let's just do one more, because here's the problem. If we don't go conquer these other people, they're going to rise up and come conquer us. And his men buy into the lie. They say, okay, let's one more. We'll just go to one more empire, one more nation state, one more whatever, one more kingdom. We'll take those people out, and then we'll be done. For how long have American politicians lied to us? How long have we been fighting for this country for a lie? If Alexander had not lied to his men, if he had just turned back and focused on strengthening his empire, Macedonia probably would not have been conquered by the Romans. By the way, do you know what the Romans did after they even early on? You know what they did to empires they conquered? They took them into slaves. When the Romans conquered Macedonia, Macedonia had about 300,000 people. And all 300,000 of them were either killed or taken into slavery by the Romans. Not an easy slavery, by the way. I don't know how much y'all know about Roman history. The question that I have that I'll leave you with is when the American empire falls, and I do believe the American empire is falling, it is collapsing as we speak. To whom will it belong? It will belong to the strongest. The question is, which culture in the United States is the strongest? Who's the strongest man? Who is the strongest leader? What is the strongest people? What is the strongest tribe in these former United States of America? That is who is going to end up taking at least the territory they control. And I'm not saying that these states will just disappear and we'll cover up all brand new states. I'm saying culturally, you look at these third world countries, they have political boundaries. They've got states or oblasts or whatever. But there's a cultural boundary as well. And my concern is, I don't know what the strongest tribe in America is. I really don't know. I'd like to think I know. I'm going to question I'm not just going to assume that it's us. I'm going to question my assumption that maybe it's not us. Well, I'm over time. But thanks for listening to the show. I'll be back at 2 p.m. tomorrow at streaming live at forwardobserver.fm, or you can catch the podcast later. By the way, if you think the show deserves, I put a lot of time and effort into the show. If you think I deserve 5 stars, please leave me a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you're on YouTube, please check out or like and subscribe YouTube. Send the YouTube channel to your friends. If you like this episode, please send it out to them. I'm really trying to make a very good, trying to come up with some super engaging topics, read a bunch of books, talk about what I learned, and that's going to be the show, along with some guests along the way. So thanks for listening. Until tomorrow, be well and stay out front.